Coming up on this episode of Harmless.
We're taught right from the academy, our job is to take bad guys off the street, to lock bad guys up, somebody else's job to deal with victims. One of them says to the other, "You think anyone's looking for this girl?" And that is where it all started. You couldn't see any facial features. It looked like he was taken in a dark room and likely while that child was asleep. This is one of the first cases where I start using some really intense image forensic techniques. We truly rescued that victim because she was completely unaware that anything happened. And it turns out the offender in this case was a 16-year-old boy who had not gotten to the point where...
Welcome to Harmless, the podcast. I'm your host, Eric Oldenburg, and today I have with me, once again, the venerable Jim Cole. Now, Jim Cole is a retired supervisory special agent with the Homeland Security Investigations, and he has over 25 years of experience leading and coordinating investigations related to child sexual exploitation, victim identification, digital forensics, and victim services. Jim is now the Chief of Law Enforcement Enterprise and Technology for Operation Lightshine. This is my second interview with Jim, and for more information about who he is, please refer to his first interview on this show. This interview is more specific to the victim identification efforts and how they became a thing in this world of investigations. Jim has incredible knowledge, experience, and wisdom when it comes to these types of investigations and how to handle them, and I'm so very happy to share that with you today. So without further ado, I give you What About the Victims with Jim Cole. Today, I am here with Jim Cole. Jim Cole is an extremely important person in the world of child exploitation who I was fortunate enough to meet in, I believe it was 2011 at a conference in Dallas. Our Internet Crimes Against Children unit had gone to Dallas looking for some solutions to help us with this avalanche of child exploitation that we were going through. And I attended a class for something called Project Vic, an initiative called Project Vic that we can always discuss at another time. But I watched that presentation and I had no idea. I had been working internet crimes for 7 years at that point, and I had never even considered victim identification. It wasn't even something that was discussed in our field of work. It was always about the imagery and the offenders. Imagery, offenders, put away the perpetrators. It was not victim focused. And then I met you and I heard you speak, and you said something that I'll never forget. Don't put victims in the evidence room. And that right now just ran a chill up the back of my spine to know how many children over the years were put in that evidence room that have to silently deal with knowing that's out there that nobody knows. I can't even begin to imagine how that could affect somebody. But your approach to this work and the way you spread that groundbreaking approach, the correct way to do these investigations, changed the world forever, changed the worlds of investigations, and change the lives of so many people, so many children, and so many children that you've never met, that we'll never meet. But you completely changed the landscape of these investigations. Now we're focusing more on the victim, which we should have been focusing on from the beginning. We just didn't know because we're cops. You arrest people, you put them in jail. You arrest them, you put them in jail. That's what we do. So to have that vision to go see through that is just, it was absolutely amazing. It was captivating for me to be in that presentation. I remember the room it was in. That's how much of an impression that had on me. And then from that point forward, I told myself, I want to follow what these guys are doing. Jim Cole, Rich Brown, Johann Hoffman. These guys are, man, they are doing shit that I want to be a part of. And from that point, I started to work teaching part-time. I remember I was sitting there teaching and I taught some block, and I finish my block and I walk over and you look at me and you go, that was a really good job, man. And I can't even tell you how much that meant to me. When you said that to me, I was like, wow, thank you, man, because you're a hell of a presenter. You captivate audiences, you hold attention. I've taught with you. I know how good you are. I am so excited, first of all, to know you. Second of all, I'm really excited to be your friend because I've looked up to you for many, ever since I've met you, I've looked up to you. Let's talk about how did we go, Jim? How did we go from offender-based to victim-based?
It's an interesting story because, like you, so my journey to start is I had been an investigator in the military. And then, very interestingly enough, I transitioned out of the military into civilian law enforcement, but in a very unique jurisdiction. I was actually a tribal police officer in Indian country on a Native American reservation in Oregon. And I spent 7 years on that reservation. And one of the things it did was I grew up in a very sheltered kind of community. My parents were like, I never saw my parents fight. They were super role models. And I came out into the world a bit naive because I was so sheltered. And I went to a really good high school, and not that there weren't issues there, but so then going in the military, it opens up your eyes to more. But then going to work at the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs in Central Oregon was a whole new kind of awakening into things like poverty and hopelessness and just things that ail people. And then also people who rise up above it and excel. And I did patrol, general detectives, narcotics, then to violent crime. And then eventually I was promoted to take over the detective division, supervising 7 detectives, working all those different things. And we did almost all the cases we did out there were federal cases. Any felony would go into federal court. And I had worked a number of what we think of the hands-on child abuse cases. But on the reservation, technology had not really, it just wasn't a thing. People didn't really have like computers in their homes. And back then, we're talking about the mid to late 90s, we didn't have cell phones. They were expensive. And so we didn't have this digital crime on the reservation, but I had worked a number of the child abuse cases. And I remember the impact that had, vulnerable victims to, but those cases are really hard because you often don't have physical evidence. You often don't have a lot of those cases sometimes are not prosecutable in a criminal court because of those issues. But worked with the FBI office very closely, was an FBI task force officer at the time. And one of the FBI agents there kept pushing me like, you need to go federal, you need to go federal, you need to go federal. But I was actually working on the reservation and it's a different story, but 9/11 happens. And shortly after that, a lot of the federal agencies started hiring, and the U.S. Customs Service, which very few people knew about, right? Well, it wasn't the FBI, it wasn't, but in my opinion, was one of the best kept secrets in the U.S. government, a huge jurisdiction as far as the type of crimes they worked, and with additional authorities that like even the FBI doesn't have, that are unique to the Customs Service, with customs authorities, the Title 19. And I ended up getting picked up in the Portland, Oregon office, and my first week on the job, I'm sitting in my office doing some what we call broker investigation because I was new. And I hear my boss down in the corner, something's not right. And I hadn't been around him enough to know how he was. But I remember I was one of the only people in the office at the moment. So I teetered down 2 doors to his office, poked my head in. Everything all right, boss? And he's upset. And he's, I can't get this Word document. Every time I hit enter, justifies to the left. It wouldn't justify middle. So I sit down and I fix it for him in 30 seconds. And I just basically fixed it for him. And he goes, "Oh, you're a technology guy." And like, fixing a Word document, it makes me a technology guy, but sure. But I legitimately. So I was like, yeah, I like technology and I'm an early adopter kind of guy. And he said, look, all these CP cases that's what we called it back then, CP, the child pornography. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but he's like, all these CP cases are going online on the internet now. And I need somebody who the guy who's doing it, he's going to retire in 9 months. I need somebody who understands technology to basically take this over. So I'm going to stick you with Ben, and I need you to just sponge everything you can off of him. And so Ben is a guy who had been working that crime type for what feels like eons, old school. He's a guy who was doing undercover at a port where boxes of child exploitation magazines and books are being smuggled into the country and doing face-to-face deals. And so that's the era that he was in. And everything was transitioning online away from that once the advent of the internet. And I just started learning everything from Ben. And like you, I was taught that traditional way of, look, we're police officers, right? We're taught right from the academy, like our job is to take bad guys off the streets, right? Lock bad guys up, all the things that go with that. Somebody else's job to deal with victims. It's somebody else's job to do those kinds of things. Our job is the criminal enforcement aspect, interviews, those kind of things. And going into the child exploitation work, when that's ingrained in you with police, then that's what you do. You focused on the bad guy, and in turn, you focused on this evidence that the bad guys had. And at the time, now we're seeing this explosion of the images and videos that are online and things like news groups. And back then it was like IRC. And then of course, all the peer-to-peer file sharing network. So it was like the Nutella network, and later on we get into eDonkey and then all those things. And so that's where we were finding bad guys. And so it's in all of that, I start doing those cases just like that. We would get a lead, we would work that up to a residential search warrant. We go do the search warrant. We seize all the shit. We seize the phones and the laptop. And back then, we're seizing tower computers, right? And big monitors. And our evidence room looked like a computer repair store, right? Back room. And so we're bringing all these things in, and then we're doing the forensics. And I was also a digital forensic examiner. So it was like 50% doing the cases and 50% doing the forensics, oftentimes doing the forensics on my own cases. And we were taught to basically go in. Number one, it was this premise that the hands-on offenders, producers are rare, right? And so most of these guys are the downloaders, the traders.
Consumers, yeah.
Yep, the consumers. And so our crux was like this factory setting of, in all the images and videos, which ones are illegal, right? For us, the federal definition. You would do that kind of call. And then, and we would use some automated mechanisms like cryptographic hashing, which made that easy, right? Because, and for those who are not familiar with cryptographic hashing, and I do think you talk about this in your definition.
Yes.
Yeah. But basically it's the digital fingerprint. So we'd have a list of digital fingerprints that we could just run in an automated way, say, yep, these are files that are in the list and therefore are likely to be. Now there could be mistakes, but you'd still have to review it. But it would make at least the first call of that in an automated way fairly simple for you.
So Jim,
then you go looking
real quick. Where'd you get these hashes from? These fingerprints? Where did you get them?
Yeah, so like we were trading them. You go to a conference and you'd have a thumb drive, and here's this, or someone would send it to you. Back then they're pretty small. You could email the list.
Realize this is just the fingerprints. We're not passing around thumb drives with material on them.
That's right. It's purely textual information. Yes. There's no way to get back to an image. So it would just be like, to be honest with you, it would be a rich text file of a list of these cryptographic hashes, which are just alphanumeric character strings. That's it. Yep. And so no risk in that really. So anyway, you'd create them yourself when you found new files in a case, and you said you would add it to the list. The next time, if it was there, you'd find it. And so the problem is we relied very heavily on those lists, right, to find the evidence. And then we go look in the areas based on the modality that they were using to download or trade, where we would expect evidence to be found in these different files, and we would add that over. And what we were doing on the federal side is now we're charging these individuals usually with possession of child pornography, which is the federal statute, distribution, if we could prove that they had sent it anywhere, and then a charge called receipt, which we could find the mechanism that they received it, right? Now, you would think if they possessed it, it's a foregone conclusion that they received it, but legally we had to actually show how they received it in order to charge that.
Was part
Now,
of
those
that was part of that being able to prove that they observed it too, like they looked at it, they opened the file,
we actually didn't have to do that. There was no requirement to do that if they were in constructive possession. Now they did have to have access to it. For instance, if we get a computer that was being used by like a family, you wouldn't charge like the wife because that material was on the computer. Only the husband's account had access to it, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Right? It was in his account. So we would go through it. And so in that, those charges, the receipt and distribution carry a 5-year mandatory minimum prison sentence. And possession has no mandatory minimum. So if it's just purely possession, the prison sentence could honestly be probation up to maybe a year or two in jail, but usually not. And so the 5-year mandatory minimum was part of some legislation that had gotten passed in 2008 called the Protect Act of 2008, which established some of these mandatory minimums. The problem was judges really don't like mandatory minimum because in the case of mandatory minimums, you now have Congress taking away discretion from the judiciary, right? The judges. And the judges, if there's any judges watching this, please don't take offense, but
Hey,
the
interesting
judges really
what you
like
said.
mandatory minimums because judges see themselves like they're all powerful. Like judges, I'll tell you, judges are pretty much all powerful, especially like federal district court judges. Oh, they don't really have a boss.
Yeah, right.
They're
Their boss is the Constitution, right?
That's right. They're very powerful. And now there's like ethics boards, and there's certainly appellate court judges or the Supreme Court at the top, which could review, but it's not like a boss type situation. So judges don't like that. So what we found was pretty much in every case, judges were sentencing to the 5 years. It was just a flat 5-year. They'd just do the mandatory minimum and out. Pretty much without, even if we had 10 counts of distribution and 10 counts of receipt, they're going to get 5 years, right? Flat. Now, when we were using that methodology and we were focusing on kind of these files that are commonly known, right? Like we're encountering them a lot. Then what happens is the files, like if your offender, there's a few scenarios. If your offender is a hands-on offender and has produced child sexual abuse material, which is the name that we prefer to call this content, not child pornography, because pornography, the word in and of itself intimates consent. It intimates that.
John Roush, I think John Roush said it the best to me. It was John that said that to me. He said, maybe it was Warren Palmer. He said, when you call it child pornography, you are describing it from the offender's perspective.
That's
and it
right.
is not from your perspective. It is horrific from this. So there is
right.
no horror.
And from the victim's perspective, it is horrific.
Yes. And so being a victim and knowing that is being called pornography out there.
Right.
Unbelievable.
Right. So unfortunately, in the U.S., the federal statute and many state statutes still use the term. There are efforts to change that, but it's an act of Congress.
It's an act of Congress.
It is literally an act of Congress, but we've been championing these things. There's lots of us that have been championing these things, so I hope that does change. But for now, what happens is when you're using these hash sets and you're doing some of the things we're doing, you tend to focus on those files that it finds, but these are because by the very nature of them being in the list means they're not new, right? So new content will only be found if we dig in and look for it. And this is what I was doing. There's a couple, and on the production side, there's a couple of scenarios. So the offender that you did the search warrant on could be a hands-on offender in producing material. And therefore you would hopefully find that material, or that material could exist on the devices that you seized. The offender could be in your offender that you did a search warrant on, could be in direct communication with a producer who has shared that newly produced with your offender, even though they're not the person that's putting the hands on. But again, if you don't go in and look for that, you'll never figure that out and then get back to the offender and the child. And so this is what was happening, is we were not making those connections. We were not figuring out when the person that we had just done a search warrant, we had just kicked in the door, did all the things, seized a bunch of stuff, and then we're charging them with the lowest level of crime, right?
Yeah.
Because we weren't figuring out how to bubble up. And it didn't become apparent to me until a very specific case. And I won't name that case for the privacy of the survivor and her family, but I refer to that case in the article that I wrote as the V case. And in the V case, the very first time that I had ever seen is we get a lead in.
When was this,
that
Jim?
Started.
When was this?
So this would have been 2004. And so we get this lead in that comes through NECMEC, but it had started with the Toronto Police Service in a fairly newly formed child exploitation unit that was being run by two guys, and you named one already. That's Warren Bomer and Bill McGarry. And Warren and Bill, again, pillars in this, again, two guys that what you said about me, which it always makes me a little uncomfortable, but I've said the same thing about many others in our community. Two guys who has affected the lives of so many children around the world, and those children will never know their names. But Warren and Bill literally kept seizing, and around the world were seizing this series of child sexual abuse material because the offenders found it was very appealing to them, and it was one of the most popular child exploitation series for a very long time.
So so imagery from this set is something that would repeatedly be found in these hash lists that we have, right?
Yeah, it would repeatedly be found on offenders' computers and on various online platforms. It proliferated the peer-to-peer, and everybody knew the name.
Yeah,
it was very easy.
And obviously I've seen, I know.
Yeah, you're very familiar with it.
Mhm.
And so that series, at one point, it was being seized by law enforcement and submitted to NECMEC at its height, over 12,000 times a week. Think about that.
Wow.
Right? At its height. And unfortunately, in the scheme of things now, it's not even in the top 10 anymore. But back then, that's a massive amount of just the distribution globally. And it was being seized all over the world. This wasn't unique to the United States or our northern brothers and sisters in Canada.
Because there's no borders now. There's no borders now.
There's no borders. That's right. And so the Bill and Warren had 5 cases in a row where that series was in the seizure. And then one day they're processing the case in the lab, and there's still a point of contention on who said what to who. But one of them says to the other, "Hey, you think anyone's looking for this girl?" And that is where it all started. That's really the tipping point, because then Warren and Bill were like, maybe we should, but not that I'm aware of, maybe we should look for her. And so they start applying some technique that were novel, where we tended to focus when we're seizing this stuff on the illegal abuse, the sexual act that's occurring, the rape of the child. And there's not a ton of evidence there into attribution of identity, location, those types of things, right? So they look into the background of the material. They look at different things, metadata and things, And they start to be able to figure out some clues that indicated that the video that they were looking at that had the most clues to it had been likely produced, filmed in the Portland, Oregon, in the general Portland, Oregon area. And at the time, I was an agent in Portland, Oregon, and my really good, like my best friend and colleague for many years, Josh Finley. So he and I are partners working this crime type in Portland. Ben had retired at that point. So Josh and I are like the go-to guys. The case comes in, and I was a newly coined forensics guy. So basically, Josh and I are like, let's be agent, co-case agent. You'll be responsible for the investigation. I'll be responsible for the digital investigation and the forensics. And so we were working very closely. I don't want to leave our ICAC partners out. We were working very closely with the Oregon ICAC. We had routine meetings just about this case. Like we set up a task force about this case. And we did all kinds of things. We started doing things like, so for instance, in one of the videos, there are 9 videos in total that were produced by the offender. And in one of the videos, the audio is very poor and you can see her speaking, but we couldn't make it out. And so we actually went to the Oregon Institute for the Deaf and we had them lip read and translate what she said just in hopes that there was some clue there. We started pulling we had lots of images of her face. So we created a few of the different version looks that she had of her face. We then went out to the schools. We created flyers. We went to the schools. We worked with school resource officers. It just hit basically every school in the area. Do you recognize this child? Do you recognize this child? We actually had a teacher come forward and say, boy, it looks a lot like one of my students, but she passed away over the summer last year from cancer.
Wow.
It's one of the hardest things that we'd ever had to do was go knock on the door of these parents and to get some photographs of this child so that we could do a comparison. You talk about a difficult conversation, but the parents were great and they provided us and we did a comparison and it was not her. And I was both saddened and relieved at the same time, right? Because we want to find this child, but I was really glad it was not the child who'd passed away of these parents. And so we plotted every scar, mark, mole on her body, as well as what we could see of the offender's body. And in doing that, there was a specific mole pattern on the arm of the victim. And so then we went around and we went to all the youth homes, like where runaway children who are recovered would be housed if there were other issues. We went around to all those kind of locations and basically would talk to these girls kind of one-on-one and just, hey, will you show us your arm? And and if there was something similar, investigate further. But we were like, no, it was a very simple way to rule a lot of these kids out. And so we were doing those kind of things. We went and grabbed yearbooks from every school and had yearbook parties where we're flipping through the pages and then we just put a sticky note and then our intel analyst is going in and looking up the family. And then we would go out and make contact and we ruled all those out. Like we did so many of those. And this went on for a year and a half. So for a year and a half, like we're looking for her.
How much of your caseload was focused, or how much of your time was spent in that year and a half focused on finding her?
A lot. We still had cases coming in too. We're still doing the other search warrants. We're still doing the other leads, but we were I'll tell you, this really lit a fire under us, like this scenario. And we felt like, because look, there were a couple of restaurant fast food cups in the background. They were one of the major clues. And through painstaking work, because it isn't CSI, folks, I'm going to tell you, like what you see on TV, and not that we can't do some pretty snazzy stuff, but in this time period, video cameras were still new, right? And the resolution on these things was not great to begin with. But then on top of it, when you compress it to send over the internet for him to put out, it further throws data away to compress it so that it would, and again, in 2004, the internet was a lot different than it is today. It wasn't the dial-up, but it was like cable. It was just above that. So the speeds of the internet weren't great at the time. It meant that this video was grainy and just difficult to see. And now we're looking at these objects that aren't even the focus of the video there in the background. The Bill Warren did some amazing work, and it took them almost a full week to figure out what the logo was on these cups. And interestingly enough, these cups, one cup was turned so that you could see the left side of the logo, and one cup was turned so you could see the right side of the logo. And they literally had to take those and put them together to get what they could of the whole logo. And so going through, they found that it was a fast food restaurant that fortunately there were only 39 locations within 50 miles of Portland, and they were headquartered in Portland, and they were regional. So there were only 39 locations on the planet at the time, and they were all within 50 miles of Portland, Oregon, which is one of the major reasons like we think this happened here. Another was a sweatshirt and a logo, and that was a trademark owned by a regional department store that's only on the West Coast and also was headquartered in Portland. And we went and talked to the manager about that sweatshirt, and they confirmed to us that had only been sold in the Oregon and Washington markets. It had not been sold in California. We were pretty sure we were in the right area. So because of those issues, like, we pulled out all the stops. We dedicated a lot of time and effort to try to find and safeguard this child. And it's a weird thing because when you're spending so much time trying to find this child, even though you have not met this child, you develop this weird relationship because you now care about this child. And even though you've never met this child, you've only seen the images, and you become, if I don't do this extra thing, she's still out there. And you know what I'm talking about. And that can develop into what we call compassion fatigue, is you feel like you haven't done enough, yet you're killing yourself to do enough. And it will never feel like you've done enough until you hit success, right? And that can burn people out and cause a lot of stress and things in people's lives. But we were really dedicated. So we put a lot of hours in this, and so did our partners, right? It wasn't just Josh and I.
Real quick. So when you first started doing this, was just nobody, like you didn't have any guidance. There was no, hey, we should do this. Maybe it was just you guys all came up and as investigators were like, let's do the mole patterns. Let's look. That is fantastic, man. Because you had no guidance. This is like,
I just had my previous experience. It's a kind of a funny story on the mole patterns, because so I was a homicide detective, right? And we would go to autopsies, and I would, if it was an adult male, we had an adult male figure that had the front and the back side, and you would stand there while the medical examiner is calling out anything like the stab wounds, and you would mark it on the diagram, and the gunshot wound or the whatever it is, and even tattoos and other scars and marks. You're doing this thing while you're there at the autopsy. And so I had left over from that kind of just at home in my old like files. I had all these diagrams of adults, children, like you name it, all the way down to like infant, of these pre-done body diagrams. And it was that experience that led me to think, okay, let's plot the right. So went and grabbed that, and so pulled one of those out. Okay, Josh, I don't know how this happened, to be honest. Josh was assigned to do the suspect, and I was doing the victim. And Josh, I didn't think to be like, hey, Josh, here's an adult male. So Josh drew this very rudimentary on yellow legal pad that is almost comical. I still have it, and I'm pretty sure this won't come out before his retirement. So he's retiring in a few weeks, just in early February. And I am framing that and going to present it to him at his retirement
That's awesome.
because it's hysterical.
Yeah.
And you've seen the presentation
Yep.
with it in there, but he actually drew the penis of the suspect. And I always joke, like, that's not a one-eyed baseball player because of the way he drew it. And it always gets a good laugh. But so I'm presenting that to him at his retirement.
Awesome. I didn't know he was retiring.
So-
That's fantastic. Good for him.
Yeah,
What's he
yeah,
going to do
it's
with himself
exciting.
when he leaves?
Yeah, he's going to go work for a tech company in the space. I
Yeah.
can't really say what that is just yet, but
Right.
he's going to go work for a tech company and a couple other things. And he's actually going to come do some like unpaid associate work for us at Operation Lightshine,
Oh, nice.
which I'm sure we can talk about later. But
About
so
that
he's
later,
staying in
for sure.
space. He's staying in the space and doing good things. I'm really looking forward to Josh being retired and the shenanigans that we'll get into. But so this is all going on, and we're doing all this. And fast forward a year and a half, it's now, I think it was January or so of 2006. And I'm at the first ever Project Safe Childhood conference after the Project Safe Childhood, a initiative of the U.S. Attorney General's office to focus on child exploitation cases. Now every U.S. Attorney's office has a Project Safe Childhood coordinator, but this was the very first ever conference. They don't do the conferences anymore. They did 3 or 4 of them, and then they just grouped them with the ICAC, the national training. But so we're at this Project Safe Childhood conference. I'm getting ready to go to dinner with Jen Lee at the time, now Jen Newman of NCMEC, who's one of her and Michelle Collins at the time were the ones who really set up the child victim identification program at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They are the pioneers of doing that from that side of the house. And Jen and I are getting ready to go to dinner, and she gets a call from Warren Bulmer as I'm standing there, and I see her on the phone. She says, "Oh, hey, hi, Warren." And then I hear her go, "Hold on, I got Jim right here." She puts the phone down her shoulder. She looks at me and she goes, "Jim, have we found V?" And I'm like, not that I know of. Why? And so she puts him on speaker, and he goes on to tell us that the victim in that case was just featured, and the case was just featured on the television show America's Most Wanted, and that the offender is a international wanted fugitive. And we're like, this is like bombshell news. And I'm like, can't be. This gotta be a mistake. And Jen and I are like, what? And so instead of going to dinner, we literally go up and grab a laptop and we go online and we look at the America's Most Wanted site and we find the case and we open it up, and sure as shit, there she is. And we're like, oh my God, that's her. Like, Jenna, that's her. But now she's older. And so what happened?
Hold on, let me back up for a second.
Yeah.
So he was featured on America's Most Wanted as an international fugitive, not her. It was about him, or was it about her as well?
Yes, it was about her as well.
Okay.
So they interviewed her. So what happened was, as part of this manhunt from him and featuring the case, so America's Most Wanted, it's an older show now, so not everybody may be familiar, but they would feature all these fugitive cases from around the country. And some of them would get really short segments, but they just flash like a picture of the guy, like he was wanted for this crime. But then others, they would do like these full featured stories where they would interview the police detective, they'd interview a victim or whatever. Well, this was one of the cases that was featured, right? It got like a full several minute feature on the show. And so at the time, from when all this abuse material and everything happened to the point in time that the case is featured on America's Most Wanted, she goes from her abuse occurs really, her abuse really occurred from infancy on. But the videos that were produced and distributed were of her around 9, 10, 11 years old. But he held on to them and didn't distribute them. So there was this lag time. He filmed them for himself And then there's like a few year lag before he actually shared it for the first time online. And then he shared more. So and we didn't know, we think we're looking for this 9, 10-year-old girl. In reality, she was now in her teen, but we had no way to know that. And then when she's featured on America's Most Wanted, she was 17 years old. The problem was, and I'll get into this because it's also was one of our systemic problems from those days. The problem was, so what happens is she actually self-rescued. So her father's abusing her for a long time, filming her, doing all this thing. Mom and dad are divorced. So when mom and dad were together, he was abusing her from a young age. Then when mom and dad were divorced, he's still abusing her during his custody, right? Weekend, every whatever. So he's still abusing her. She then comes to realize, because he had groomed her into, this is like healthy for you. This is, I'm teaching you about sex for when you're all the things that offenders do to groom children. She was heavily groomed. But then she has the health class in school where they talk about body safety. They talk about those types of things wrong. Like, this isn't right. So she, on the next visit with her dad, says, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm done. And then he says, just please don't tell. I'll stop, but please don't tell. She agreed. They make an agreement. So she's okay, I won't tell. And then at some point later, we're talking months, maybe even a year and a half, she's watching Forrest Gump with her mom and her stepdad now, who's wonderful. They're wonderful people. She's watching Forrest Gump, and there's a scene in Forrest Gump where the lead female character, Jenny, intimates that she's being sexually abused by her father, and they go out and they burn down. And that scene gives her the courage to tell her mom what had been happening. And so she tells her mom that her biological father had been abusing her and all these things, but she doesn't mention that it was filmed, right? That there was any video. They contact the police agency. It's complicated because she lives in one jurisdiction. He lived in the county next to it. So now we have two police agencies. They do a really good investigation, to be honest. They do a good job but their information, it's a child abuse case. It's not an online child abuse case. It's not an ICAT case. It is, we have an allegation from a victim that she was sexually abused by her father. That's the facts, right? That's what we know. And so they go to interview him because at this point, now months, years have passed. There's no physical evidence of abuse. There's only, it's the he said, she said, right? Proverbial kind of thing. So they interview him. He denies everything like did happen. The stepfather, he starts thinking about it, and he's like, I wonder if there's any evidence on the computer that the biological father had basically gotten a new computer and handed down his old computer to the victim. And he's like, I wonder if I go look on this computer, if I'll find anything that would help the case. Because the police are kind of like, he denies it. It's not right. You know how that works. And so he starts digging in, and what does he find? He finds a few of the videos buried in the operating system. And so they go back to the police and say, now we have here you go, hard evidence. The offender in this case knew it was only a matter, he knew it was out there. And he had figured out during his interview, they don't know about the videos, but it's only a matter of time before I got to get out of Dodge. So after the interview, within a couple of days, he packs up, he flies from Seattle-Tacoma Airport to Canada. And then he disappears in Canada. We later learn he actually flew to mainland China, and not Beijing. Like, he went deep in and was working as an IT professional in mainland China for quite a while before we finally figured it out. So the law enforcement agency, they're like, oh, this guy flew to Canada. We got to bring in the marshals now. So they bring in the U.S. Marshals. They get what's called a UFAP warrant, unlawful flight to avoid prosecution, which basically allows the marshals to use federal resources to arrest somebody on a state charge, as long as it's a felony and all these things. And obviously this is. So they're looking at now, the computer goes to a forensic examiner. Forensic examiner does the thing. He puts everything out to a disk. He gives it to the detective. The detective thinks the forensic examiner is submitting the images to NCMEC. The forensic examiner thinks the detective's going to submit them to NCMEC. As you can imagine, it does not get submitted to NCMEC. We never find out through the right way, like the deconfliction mechanism that's in place, that she's been identified. And so it doesn't make its way to NCMEC at this point, which is now we're on this phone call and we're all dumbfounded. And we're looking at this thing going, yeah, but how did this happen? So I called Josh, and we put Josh in touch with the detective in the jurisdiction where this happened. And they compare and confirm it is in fact her. It is definitely her. And then we have to now prove that. Now we worked on a case to prove that. So it wasn't Portland, Oregon, but the first video was filmed in Portland, Oregon, and he was less careful because it was the very first video. So that's why there were clues that existed, but later there were less clues, but all those occurred at his house. But she was under the age of 12 when that happened. And there's a really hard-hitting federal charge, which is transformation of a minor in interstate or foreign commerce, and then engage in illicit sexual conduct, right? That carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 30 years per instance. So in this case, he transferred her from Washington State into Oregon State, engaged in illicit sexual conduct on video. That's a pretty easy charge. But we have to do things like, okay, where did it happen? What was the hotel? We want to find that. We want to document it. So we had some clues. We had what we could see. We had interviewed her. She had described it as having an Asian restaurant in the lobby, having large colored cinder block, which couldn't exactly, thought it was like red or brown maybe. And then we could see in the video, aspects of the room, but not, of course, the outside of the hotel. So now we break out, we basically get the ICAC, us, our whole office. We split up into teams of two, and we plot every hotel in the greater Portland metropolitan area, and we start going to every one. And we have some pictures that we pulled from the video. It could be one of your rooms, just like at any time. And it's interesting because one of Josh and I's fellow agents had gone to a hotel, shown the picture, and the manager at that hotel said, "Oh, I know where that is. I used to work there. I used to be a manager at that hotel, but they're tearing it down as we speak now, in the middle of being torn down." This guy named Sam calls us and he's like, "Hey, I think we got it. This is it. This is the location. On our way there now. We converge on it." And the hotel was basically in just a rubble pile. Yeah, you can't make this up. Like, out of all the hotels,
Yeah.
it's a rubble pile. And in my presentation, I have a picture that I took of the rubble pile.
Yeah.
You're just like, wow, how this happened? But we were able to make contact with the owners, get insurance photos. They had taken great insurance photos. We got those insurance photos. Then we're able to do a comparison and show it was that hotel.
Yeah, that's in your presentation too, is the pictures of the inside of the room.
Yeah.
It was really cool.
Yeah. We end up being able to charge him with multiple massive federal felony counts for production of child sexual abuse material, numerous counts of that. Like, every kind of instance is a separate count. We were able to charge him with the transportation of the minor. We were able to charge him. And then in the state, they were able to charge him with all the basically child sexual abuse and rape charges. So he's looking at this massive thing now. He's still in the wind at this point. We set up a separate task force. So Josh and I were not on that task force just for the manhunt. That was other HSI folks, primarily out of our Seattle office, and the U.S. Marshal Fugitive Task Force up there. and we put him on the Marshal's 10 most wanted. So he was a 10 most wanted fugitive after all this came about. He wasn't initially, the Marshals were looking for him, but he wasn't a top 10 fugitive until all this kind of bubbled up. And then HSI, we put him on our top 10 most wanted fugitives as well. And then that task force did really great work while we continued just to do the case to support the charges of finding him, and found him in China. And then we're able to get him arrested by the Chinese authorities for fraudulently entering their country on a forged passport, those kind of things, like an immigration violation in China. But we don't have an extradition treaty with China. So it became this diplomatic nightmare with the State Department. There was all this stuff going on. And then eventually they deport him into Beijing, which was a British territory at the time. It's no longer that. And it was actually in transition to becoming Chinese. There was this 10-year kind of period. So we were just inside that 10 years. He gives in, he actually puts a bunch of the into Hong Kong, not Beijing. He puts some of the Hong Kong police officers in the hospital in an assault at that, but they get him in custody. And then we finally get him, he finally waives extradition. We get him back to the United States, where he pleads guilty and is sentenced to 50 years in federal prison on the plea, which prevented the victim in this case did not have to testify. And he was 50 at the time of his sentencing. So he's, even on good behavior, he'd be 90 years old before he could be eligible for parole. And he'll die in prison. Yeah. And I'm sad to say he has suffered a couple of very serious assaults while in prison.
You're sorry to say that?
Downside. Yeah, I'm sorry it's a sad. Now the sad news is, well, the sad news is that taxpayers had to basically pay for a facial reconstruction, and some pretty severe medical care. But anyway, karma has definitely gotten to him.
But that case, victim identification was born from that. And then let me ask you,
victim identification in North America was born through that law enforcement victim ID. We did have, look, Anders Persson in Sweden, before all this happened, had really been doing some victim ID. He's the first one to develop, hey, we should be taking all these cases and putting them in one centralized database so that we can know which victims are identified and which ones aren't. And that system was called ICADE back in the day. And then that system, he started in Sweden, and then it got moved to Interpol, and it became what's now known as the International Child Sexual Exploitation Database, or ICSA. But we consider Anders as what we would call the great grandfather of victim ID. But in North America, we were behind our European and Scandinavian counterparts. They were really way ahead of us in that realm. There wasn't a lot of communication back then, but it wasn't really till Warren and Bill said, hey, is there anybody looking for this kid? Then we do the physical things to try to find her. And then, I end up meeting with the family, meet with the survivor, meet with the mom. And I'm like indelibly just impacted by that meeting. They had no idea all the things that we had done. And it didn't come out in court because there was no trial. It was basically, he pled out and there was a sentencing hearing. So none of those things come out. So we had this meeting, and a prosecutor starts saying, he's basically going through with them. He's like, Josh and Jim basically did this and the school to death and that and the moles and the things. And they're blown. And they're like, for a year and a half, they have been looking for you. And they were brought to tears by that. And it impacted me. I get emotional thinking about it. And I was like, oh, I felt like, man, we didn't find her. At the end of the day, we did not find her. She rescued herself. And then all that effort wasn't wasted, though, right? It's not that the effort was wasted, even though it didn't result in finding her, because it taught us so much about how to think in a very different way. And it really opened up my brain to, gosh, that's just this proverbial think outside the box. So we're doing these cases, and in the first 6 months, I was able to take leads and rescue 32 kids in 6 months. And the first 6 months, it was 32 kids. But one of those cases, which ends up becoming known as the sunflower case, and we called it something different, but publicly became known as the sunflower investigation, was Mads is looking at darknet forum, and this offender comes on and posts some really dark, grainy images of, turns out the victim was 11, but dark, grainy images of this girl. You couldn't see any facial features. It looked like he was taken in a dark room, and likely while that child was asleep. And he posted some of these images up and said, I want to rape my 11-year-old sister. How do I get away with it? And of course, because he's on a child exploitation darknet board, all these offenders come on and they're giving him advice on how to accomplish this. And so you had everything from drug her, get her drunk, tie her up, groom her over time. Some of them, take it slow, it's the best way. Someone recommended he go get a specific drug from the pharmacy that would basically render her incapacitated, do whatever you want. She's a hard sleeper, you could tie her up and then just do all this stuff. And what he was doing was he was masturbating over her. He would go grab a pair of her panties out of the dresser, and he would masturbate into them over her. And those are the pictures he's taking. But he can't turn a light on because she's asleep. He can't. So they're dark and grainy, and there's no clue, right? There's nothing to go off of. And so this is a tough one. Like, we're looking at it, and it's a tough one. But we start to cull some of the things that he says, and then as a couple days go on, because we're monitoring this daily, we're monitoring this daily. We put this into ICSA, which is this global victim ID community. So now we have eyes on this 24 hours, 7 days a week, right? Just from these global investigators from Australia to New Zealand to the UK to Scandinavia to the United States to Canada. Someone's looking at this pretty much at all times as things get posted. Someone asks if they want to see her, like they want to, send a pic like of her face, like what she looks like. And so that's where it all unravels for this guy. So what he does is he starts sending these normal, everyday, non-abused images, because he's less careful with those because they're not in and of themselves illegal. And so he posts some images. There's images of the child, probably younger than 11. She was more like 9, at a community pool, like on the diving board and in the pool. And there's some great clues there, but not enough to solve it. And then he posts some images of her. It appears whoever's taking the photos in the front passenger seat, she's in the rear driver's side. And so the photos from back, and you've seen these photos in the presentation, but it takes the photo backward. And in one of those photos, they're driving on a state highway, and they happen to be driving by the state highway route number marker. And so that route number marker in this state is very unique. It turns out to be, it's a sunflower. And then the numbers of the state highway are in the middle. Now, because they're driving, it's blurry. This is where we start pulling out. This is one of the first cases where I start using some really intense image forensic techniques. And at the time, like, what I had was Photoshop.
Yeah.
And Photoshop not meant to do that work. Like John Penn, our good friend John from Adobe, the angel of Adobe.
Angel of Adobe. I love it.
Yeah, that's what they call him inside
awesome.
Adobe. What John would say is, I was always fascinated by how the tools that we created for content creators and artists, you would use in this way we never intended nor thought they would be used this way. But interestingly enough, in this particular case, they were working on a filter, and I contact John, and it ends up bringing me into helping the creative team at Adobe develop this filter.
Oh, that must have been amazing.
That's in Photoshop. So it was a really cool experience, and it happened very fast. And so we were able to figure out a couple things. We were able to figure out that the first character was a 2. The second character was too far blurred to really make it out. But because of the way it blurred, it almost looked like it was 203. And so that's initially, but it turned out it was wrong, but that's what we went with. And then also at the top, there was a white sign that indicated the direction of the highway. And it said, you could tell that it said east. And so we knew it was a highway in Kansas that ran east and west and started with a 2. That's really was the concrete information we had. So here's where we go from like this virtual work, this lab work, to now I'm going to my boss saying, we got to go to Kansas. We need to get with the office, our HSI office in Kansas, and they need to get with their partners that they work with closely. But we need to go to the Kansas because this is the very first case that actually comes in the door. This is the very first case that Mads referred over to me.
And you need to use this case to prove that this program is going to be viable.
Yeah. And it was December. So it was like right before Christmas. And I'm talking to my boss about, look, we got to go to Kansas in the middle of winter. If you've ever been to Kansas, and it's cold. And we had this plan worked out. And when we get on the ground, the agents locally had gone to Highway 203 and they had driven this whole Highway 203. And they came back and they said, it's not it. And it was very rough. It took them 5 hours to drive to this location, the middle of nowhere, Kansas. They drove up and they're like, what's in this picture does not exist on that highway. Because in the picture, not only could you see the highway sign, but you could see this round hay bale that it was the base of it. And then you could see some very specific foliage, which was like, there was a tree and there was a hedgerow, and it was very specific. And that just didn't exist. The highway sign wasn't there. Nothing matched up. So when we fly into Kansas City and get on the ground, the agent from Kansas City calls me and says, hey, we just ruled it out. We're on our way back. And so I'm in the hotel. We go check in the hotel room. I'm like, all right, what are we going to do now? We just flew to Kansas. We thought we were going to be doing this thing down here. And then just looking in that general area, because we also knew what the car was. We knew what the car was that they were in. We had actually spoken with the person who developed the interior of that line of vehicles from the General Motors Innovation and Technology Center. And they were able to give us everything you would ever want to know about that car.
I remember you telling me in a class, you were telling, there is an expert in everything. If you need to know what kind of furniture, what kind of fish in one of the investigations you talk about, there's an expert who knows how that mattress, what year it was manufactured, everything. So that's so cool.
Yeah. The hard part is finding the expert. That's the hard part.
Yeah.
But yes, that's exactly right. And so we talked to this expert. We knew the car. So now we're looking for every home that has that make and model and year range vehicle. And we were going to go hit to every house. We were just going to canvass the area. And now I'm like, what do we do now? I'm like, crap. So I'm sitting there, I'm looking at these pictures. I said, what do we know? Like I said, we know it starts with a 2. We know it runs east and west. But there are only so many highways in the state of Kansas that start with 2 and run east and west. It turns out there's more than you would think, but this is a doable problem. So I said, hey, look, it's another 4 hours for you guys to drive back here. Let's meet first thing in the morning. I have an idea. I pitched it. I told him, this is my idea. How many partners can you get to the office tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning? He's, hey, we'll get the Kansas State Patrol. We'll get Kansas City PD. We'll get some sheriff. So we get everybody the next morning. I go in the office early. We print out high resolution color images of that sign and the area and the pool and everything we knew. And we basically hand out packets. We split up into teams of 2, and we literally drove every highway in the state of Kansas that started with a 2 and ran east and west. And it is just out of, again, pure happenstance, man. It's so crazy. I think about, what are the odds of this? We exhaust that day. We don't find it. We come back together that evening. We debrief. Next morning, we're not even going to meet. We're just going to go back. Everybody go out. Here's this highways to go to tomorrow. So it's about 10:30 in the morning of the next day. And me and this agent from Kansas City are together. His name is Jesse. retired now. And we're hitting some highways, and we end up way north, kind of Kansas, and there's Highway 20, and we start on this one end. We're driving down this highway, and it's a cold, but no snow yet. It's really cold, but it's a decent day. Sun's out. We're going down the road, and we're just jibber jabbering. And every time a highway sign comes up, I'm paying particular attention, and I see this highway sign coming up in the distance. And as we get closer, I see that there's a thing at the base of it. And as we get closer, I see it's round. And as we get closer, I see it's the hay bale. And then I see the tree. Everything's starting to match up, and we're getting closer. And I'm like ready to jump out of the car. And I'm like, Jesse, that's it, that's it, that's it. And he like comes to a screeching stop, and I bolt out the door, and I come around the front, and I almost get killed by a car that's trying to pass. I'm like, and this will date me a little bit, but I'm taking my government issued BlackBerry out of my pocket, and I can still see the keypad and the whole thing, the round bezel
In the middle.
I take it out, and I just start snapping photos with this thing of the whole area. And of course, the image that we're referencing from was taken in the summer. So it's all green foliage and grass, and now we're in the dead of winter in December. So the trees are all leafless and all that, but you can still tell it's the same thing. And I am just so ecstatic. And so once we get that documented, we're like, okay, now what? So we drive to the end of that highway at Teed. We turn around, and we're like, what's the closest police department? We go back into town to the police department, go in, and it's a teeny tiny police department. The chief's working day shift. And we go in, and the lady who answers the door for us, she's like, yeah, let me get on the radio. She's the secretary, the dispatcher. Let me get the chief on the radio. She calls the chief in. He comes in, and he's, what can I do you for, fellas? And we're like, this is going to be a weird story, but here's what it is. And we show him the pictures. He goes, oh, yeah, that's the community pool in the next county over. It's right over. Just if you go to the end, take a left, take a right, go down, you'll run right into it. Okay, so we go to the pool. Sure as shit, it's the pool. Like, it's obvious right away, it's the pool. All the things match up. Yes, we're here. We go to that sheriff's department. There was no police department. Just go to the sheriff's office, tell them what we're there for. They actually, hey, let's get so-and-so. He's the narcotics detective, but he's been here forever. He knows everything. To get this narcotics detective comes in, he takes one look at her, and he goes, I know exactly who that is. And okay, and there were some pictures that we had that the subject had taken inside the home that were non-abuse images of like her playing PlayStation or whatever. And you could see through into the kitchen. You could see like the living room into the kitchen. And he's, yeah, I've been in that house. We did a search warrant there, I don't know, 6-8 months ago. And I'm like, for what? And he's, drugs. And I'm like, really? Like, yeah, her father's in prison for manufacture and distribution of meth. And we're like, holy crap. And I'm like, do you have the search warrant photos? He's like, let me go pull it up, blah, blah, blah. So he goes and he grabs the disc. We slap it in the laptop, and
Wow.
there's the kitchen. There's the, like, there, it all, and we're like, holy crap.
That's insane.
So then we write a search warrant, and we go in, we do the search warrant. And it turns out the offender in this case was a 16-year-old boy who wanted to rape his 11-year-old sister and was serious about it, had been masturbating over her. And we go and interview him, and he is a time bomb. We talked to the agency. We're like, listen, if this kid doesn't go into detention, and he did end up going into juvenile detention as a result of the case, and he was deemed so dangerous, this is hard to do. Generally speaking, you're out by the time you're 18. He was 16. They actually kept him in till he was 21 under this provision as a dangerous offender, because he'd been interviewed by a psychologist and everything. But we knew from the police interview of him, this kid's going to rape, like, he's going to be your serial rapist. Like,
yeah.
Maybe even murder. Like, this is a kid, something's gone so horribly wrong in his psyche that he is a sociopath. Like, at 16 years old. And we told him, man, I know you got to keep an eye on this dude when he gets out. And if you have an unsolved rape, he ought to be your first visit, and you ought to be getting the DNA swab. Right. He's going to be good for it. And the time that Mad sent that case to me, to the time that we went and in this case, we truly rescued that victim because she was completely unaware that anything happened. He had not gotten to the point where he had penetrated her. Certainly the conduct is horrible and nobody wants to be subjected to that, but it was going to be a whole lot worse. It was going to end up with her rape. And in that case, it's like you could truly point at it and say, we intervened and safeguarded her before that happened.
Yes.
But from flash to bang on that was 13 days. So that whole thing happens in 13 days, that we were able to just take that original lead, start working that information out, get to Kansas, get that figured out, and then we're in the house.
Wow.
Of course, that family was a very broken, that
Yeah.
family had all kinds of, the victim, I've never heard an 11-year-old use so many expletives in my life aimed at me.
Yeah.
She didn't believe us. Like she didn't believe that her brother was doing any of these things. And of course she was notorious, just a notorious heavy sleeper. So she did wake up for hardly anything, but yeah, so that's how that worked. In this same time frame, we started developing Project Vic.
What's Project Vic in a nutshell?
Yeah, so we recognized that it was difficult to do what we were asking forensic examiners and police investigators to do, to dig into this material to find victims, because we weren't really giving them the right tools, the right methodology, the right workflows, and the right technique to do that in an efficient way. So Project Vic was developed to pull all those things into one thing. And really, it wasn't until a tool like Analyze DI came on the market that you could truly do it. It revolutionized, it really made Project Vic viable, because that Analyze DI tool became the workhorse of that methodology and workflow. And like I said, we'll talk about that in another episode, but that really was one of the catalysts. But it was also about, we talked earlier about hash sets. And the hash sets, we weren't utilizing that, like, concept of hash sets to its full potential. It was just hodgepodge, and there were all kinds of problems, and not everybody had equal access. I made my own, and I because I happen to know Randy, I gave him a thumb drive with the hash drive, but there was no distribution, there was no centralized repository of hash sets, there was no quality control. So Project Vic was really stood up to accomplish all of those things.
Which in a nutshell, it's going to, so the way I look at Project Vic, what that does is, just like you said earlier, it identifies the files that law enforcement is already aware of, so you can quickly use those if you need to charge somebody. But the important part is now you can exclude those because there's no new victims, at least there's no victims in there that have not been investigated. So you're looking for it, and it 100% changed the way we did investigations in Arizona. You don't focus on the material, you focus on what's not in the material. And that completely changed the landscape as well. So, dude, thank you so much. And I know it wasn't just you, and there was a huge team of people.
Everything happens in a team.
It's a huge team of people.
Nobody accomplishes anything alone.
It's a team effort, but it takes the passion, and it takes the dedication, and it takes the ability to communicate what the needs are to people that might not understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. And it takes the right person to be able to champion that and make it what it is today. So thank you so much, Jim. I mean, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for what you've done, because not only, I'm a mental health guy, so not only does it help you exclude those files, so you can start looking at investigating where the new material and the real victims are. Not only does it do that, but it helps reduce your exposure to this material, because now the program has identified all these files that have been seen before. You don't even have to look at them at this point. You can just flag them and then report on them. So there's no need to go through the drudgery of imagery after imagery over and over and over and over and over. when you can identify that. So that really reduces, it increases your efficiency because it finds the files for you, and then it reduces your exposure, and it helps you focus on victim ID, which is what we all need to be focusing on. So kudos to you. Thank you. It's world changing for everybody, not only in this field, but anybody out there that is potentially being victimized. There is a enormous effort of the most passionate, dedicated people you could ever imagine out there looking for these victims.
That's right. Thank you for, again, having me on the show. I always enjoy, you were a big part of the journey as well. We came out to Arizona. We saw you at Dallas, and then that set up a Project Vic class in Arizona. We came out and did the Project Vic class for the Arizona ICAC and the HSI office, and FBI was there as well. And then that really started the relationship with you and David Haddad. And we end up bringing you over as one of the primary Project Vic instructors. And I see you're also a very dynamic instructor, and we played off each other very well.
Yep.
Our banter and it kept things lively and people interested. And I miss teaching with you, to be honest.
Yeah.
I do. I miss it. It was so much. It was not only I felt like we were accomplishing a lot because people would get it and they would implement it. And so we were making
You would see it. You would see it in their eyes when you would see them be like, oh my God. Yep. You could see it.
You would see the light bulb go off when we started explaining the concept.
But I was so proud to be a part of that. I just felt like I was this guy. I don't belong with these incredible people. I'm just some schmo that runs my mouth. I am just floored by all the people in this community of investigators that are trying to protect children. You're all brothers and sisters to me, man. And you've been like a big brother to me my entire journey. And I would have never even, our unit would have just been one of those units that's just offender. So man, you changed me, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing right now if it wasn't for your influence on me. So thank you very much. Your passion, you exude passion. Like when you talk to somebody about this, everybody knows this means something to you. This isn't your job. This is your mission. And that's clear. You're a passionate guy. You wear your emotions on your sleeve. And we need people like you in this field that can tell everybody that isn't like that can't express emotions. Man, thank you so much. Thank you, Jim. And I know you got to go. You got a lunch date. We'll pick this up on your next one. Great job, man.
All right, buddy.
All right. Love you, dude. See ya.
Good session.
All right.
Love you too, brother.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to this incredibly compelling episode with my good friend, Jim Cole. I look forward to having Jim on the podcast more times in the future to discuss in even more detail some of the investigations that he was a part of. Thank you for supporting this podcast. If you like this podcast, please tell at least 2 people that you think would enjoy it. And if you know someone who needs to hear this podcast, please do not hesitate to send it to them. And if you need them to hear it anonymously, do not hesitate to email me at harmlessthepodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.